Welcome to class again, kids, and I am so sorry that we are not in class to give you a nice, long, difficult test, but that's just the way things are, so we're going to have to move on for sake of time to medieval Europe. I do hope that, even if you don't remember any of the details of Central and South and North American natives, details aren't necessarily important for shaping you, shaping your mind. What is important here is the idea that world history is not just the history of white people. If you want to talk about American history, sure, talk about Europe and England coming to America. But when we're talking about world history, we need to talk about everyone. And way too often in the past, world history textbooks have ignored everyone except for Europe. And sometimes it's been through really lazy history saying, well, we just don't know much about the Indians. Well, you could learn about the Indians if you bothered to take the time and learn about the Indians. There's plenty of resources out there to learn about the natives of any continent. I hope you also learned that the people in North and Central and South America were simply people. They had some really cool civilizations. They had some really cool progress that they made, and in some places like Cahokia, there were bigger cities than there were in Europe at the time, and that's really impressive. There were also some pretty awful things that they did, such as the human sacrifice in Central America. But that, of course, does not excuse the Spaniards for coming and murdering everyone. People are people wherever you go. There's no cavemen anywhere in the world. There ever have been. I mean, there's been people living in caves, but not, stupid. The people in America were not silly savages. They were just human beings who lived in a different way than everyone else did. So with that in mind, let's move on to something that you're probably more familiar with, and that is medieval Europe. The Making of Medieval Europe, Chapter 9. Look at that knight in shining armor. This picture is a bit fantastical, maybe a bit much here, but it's definitely a picture of late medieval Europe. And how do I know that? Massive armor everywhere. Plate armor. Very light. That would be like 1100s, 1200s. During the Middle Ages, Western society had three classes. The first were the clergy. The clergy are in charge of everything church related. They had a massive difference between the church people and the lay people. Lay is just what they call everyone else. So unlike today, where your pastors are part of the congregation, back then, the church leadership was incredibly important, and they saw themselves as way more spiritual than everyone else, and they were the priests. They came between you and God. You cannot go to God except for by the priests. And we will definitely look at some of the real big problems in medieval Catholic teachings probably tomorrow. We're going to get more into that. But the clergy, they're not in charge of teaching the people the Bible. They're not in charge of helping the people, shepherding the flock. They are in charge of going to God on your behalf. They're in charge of praying and doing their thing, doing their rituals to get you into heaven, which has very little to do with you and more to do with them working. So that's why you have these monks who are living out in monasteries all by themselves. When Jesus talked to Peter, shortly before his ascension, Jesus says, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. And these leaders aren't feeding the sheep. They're not discipling people. They're not teaching people. They're just off in the monasteries doing their prayers. Second one is the nobility. This is going to include the king and then the barons and earls and noblemen and all those. And their job is to fight. And usually they're fighting one another. We do not have very clear countries in the Middle Ages. Instead, what we have is very local warlords. Your country is ruled by your king, but most of the fighting is going to be with your neighbor, not with someone who speaks a different language. So the noblemen typically fight each other as much as they fight outsiders. In fact, they would consider each other outsiders most of the time. So a lot of fighting, and that is all paid for by the nobility. Unlike today, when the United States of America will pay for our soldiers' guns and stuff, back then you paid for your own military equipment. You paid for your own soldiers' pay. You bought them food and tents and blankets and stuff. So only the rich people could afford to raise an army. But that also meant if you were rich, you could afford to raise an army. I mean, imagine if Jeff Bezos put all his money into tanks and airplanes and helicopter gunships instead of putting all his money into spaceships. I mean, he would have a rather impressive army, wouldn't he? And if he's located in, the central part of America, where has he been in, like Texas? Um, Imagine if he has just this massive army in Texas and he wants to increase his land further, he would just go invade the rest of America or maybe northern Mexico or maybe both. So he's not off fighting China, he's fighting his local neighbors. I'm glad it's not like that anymore. And then the vast majority of people would be peasants or serfs. These people have almost no rights. They typically have very rough lives. They're working incredibly hard and they don't have much to show for it. They just do whatever their nobleman tells them to do. They're the unskilled laborers for the most part. And the vast majority of people would be peasants. You're born into it, and there's no way to improve your lot in life. Kind of sad. The growth of the medieval church. Dum 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 da dum 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 da dum 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 da. The Middle Ages really began when Rome fell. So the Roman Empire had a massive effect on all of Europe. It did not own all of Europe, but it owned most of Europe and definitely affected the rest of Europe. And when Rome fell, now there is no government controlling my area. And so every area broke down into local communities. Every town was fighting each other, and there were local warlords who were in charge of everything. And of course, those local warlords evolved into medieval noblemen. Barbarians, these new people, settle down. They're not moving anymore. They're not invading. Now they are the people who live there. We get the word France from the Franks. They were one of these early barbarians that came and attacked Rome and then settled down, and they are the people who live there now. Each local barbarian warlord fights his enemies, finds a nice section of farmland and settles down and makes his own mini kingdom or own little earldom. There was only one institution that was Europe-wide that connected all of Europe together, and that is the church. Not any government factor, the church. The church is going to grow very important during the Middle Ages in power. They could tell people what to do, and people would do it because otherwise the church would send you to hell. And prestige, if you were a church leader, you had it made, and you had a lot of honor and respect for being a bishop or archbishop or whatever. And then in wealth, because they believed in works-based salvation, so many people gave their bottom dollar to the church for a chance to escape hell or escape purgatory and get straight to heaven. Many, many noblemen gave a ton of land to the church in their wills so that their souls would go to heaven. And that meant towards the end of the Middle Ages, the church owned a massive percentage of Europe. I believe they owned about a third of England at one time. A third of the entire country owned directly by the church. That, of course, means that the church acted like the noblemen, too. They were the kings of their little areas. And they, of course, owned the serfs, the peasants who lived on that area. So that meant the church had its own private army and was engaged in fighting its neighbors just like everyone else. Rather odd for a church to behave that way. The church kept many elements of Roman society intact. For example, they spoke Latin, and that meant that every monk in all of Europe could communicate with one another. At a time when it was very difficult for nations to communicate to one another, there's not a lot of schooling, there's not a lot of transportation, not a lot of visiting your neighbors, except for in armed combat. So not a lot of people learn one another's language, but all the monks speak Latin. And maybe some of the noblemen who are trained by the monks speak Latin as well. And that means when you write a book in Latin, a theological book or a law book in Latin, every other monk or classically trained person in Europe can read that book very easily. In a world before Google Translate, that was really important. The church did have some good parts to it. I'm going to be nagging and harping on the Catholic Church an awful lot, but some good aspects of the Catholic Church is that it did set up the first hospitals in Europe. It took care of the poor and the sick as best as they could. They had adoption services. In fact, if you needed to have your kid adopted, if you have a kid and you can't take care of it, what they would do is they'd put it in a basket on the church steps. And then the monk would come in the next day or whatever and find a baby on the church steps and find a family who would take care of it. So they had adoption services way back in the Middle Ages. They had hospitals way back in the Middle Ages. Typically not terribly effective by today's standards, but they would bandage you, they would get you soup, and they would get you different herbs and stuff that probably wouldn't do diddly squat. But they tried to show Christ's love. And the people definitely did see a difference between your local priests and like the leadership of the church, where a lot of the leadership of the church is very corrupt and only in it for the money. But the local monks, the local people really are trying to take care of their community as best as they can. And then the church was pretty much the only institution anywhere that had any kind of learning. So they spoke Latin and often Greek as well. And that meant the church can read Aristotle and Plato. The church can read Euclid's geometries. They could read all these classical textbooks. And so if you wanted an education, you got it from the church. And of course, the only people who could afford an education would be noblemen. But it's quite often that the nobleman's firstborn son is going to inherit the title, inherit the land, inherit the money, and the second son and third son and fourth son, they get nothing. Or they might get a few $100 and a pat on the back and said, okay, shoe fly. And so very often the second son and third son and fourth son would go into the monastery and get a classical education from the monks. What is the church? Now, if you ask a medieval person, you might get a very different answer than if you just, looked in the Bible. But to them, church meant two things. Number one, it meant the group of people who meet in your town, the local assembly of believers. So when you say Bible Baptist Church, is that the church? Well, no, it's a church. It's part of the church. But then also there is the concept of the universal church, meaning all the Christians all over the world, and not just the ones living today, but all the Christians all over the world, past, present, and future, are all members of the church. So you could say there's really only one church. Bible Baptist Church meets here on Sundays. Your church meets somewhere else on their time or whenever on Sunday they meet. And people in Saudi Arabia, there's some churches in Saudi Arabia, and they obviously have a different time zone, so they meet at a different time. But we're all members of the church. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, they assumed, they really commanded that everyone in the village go to church. So whereas we might say, church is made up of Christians, they wouldn't, they kind of would say that, but they would say everyone in town is a Christian, because of course they are. They've been baptized. That means they're a Christian and a member of the church, right? Right. So they would say like everyone in all of Europe is part of the church. They actually had a special name for Europe. They called it Christendom or Christianity land. Here we have Universal Studios. They have Harry Potter land and who knows what other lands they have. But they have Christianity land because everyone in Europe is baptized the minute they're born. That means everyone in Europe is a Christian. Doesn't work like that. Well, there is a Latin term for universal church, and that is Catholic. Catholic means universal. That means every Christian in the entire world is part of the church. And I would totally agree with these concepts. I don't agree with how they ran the church or most of their theology, but I totally agree. When Paul is discussing the church in the New Testament, he doesn't discuss the local church as often as he discusses, Christians. Here's what Christians should do. Here's what the church ought to do. Not necessarily your local church, but all Christians need to act like this. Make sense? Back when the Roman Empire was still around, the church was divided into 5 areas that were led by 5 patriarchs. These were like super pastors who were in charge of overseeing a large area. And those patriarchates were Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople. And they did grow and add a few more patriarchates. And at first, these patriarchs, the heads of their areas, were not really in charge as much as they were there for advising the local pastors. But of course, as the years went on, they did less advising and more commanding. And that is a problem. Now, of course, the Bible has a lot to say about counsel and getting advice from people and listening to wise people. In the multitude of counselors, there is safety. For instance, Proverbs says you need people to give you advice. But the New Testament really does not show some pastors commanding other pastors what to do. Now, what it does have is the apostles, like the Apostle Paul and Peter, telling other churches what to do. And I think the Catholic Church really misunderstands the concept of apostle. I believe God gave the apostles some pretty strong authority to help the church get started, and that the apostleship is now no longer. I don't believe there are any apostles anymore. I believe there's just normal pastors. And there's a reason for that. When Paul talks to Timothy and to Titus, he says, okay, here's how you pick a pastor. And he gives a list of qualifications for a pastor. And then he says, okay, here's how you pick a deacon. And he gives a list of qualifications for deacons. And he does that twice. Does he ever tell you how to pick new apostles? No, he doesn't. And you'd think, that's a very important job to be in charge of an entire region of Christians. And I would think if God was interested in telling us how to pick deacons and how to pick pastors, he would also be interested in telling us how to pick good apostles. And he didn't. So that would tell me maybe God doesn't want any apostles anymore, that was a one-time thing meant to grow the early church and not necessary anymore. Anyway, Catholic Church does believe that their leaders are basically apostles and therefore have a lot more power than the average pastor. Eventually, the Patriarch of Rome got way more authority and started even telling the other patriarchs what to do, and eventually evolved into what we have today, the Pope. All right, so eventually the church in Rome, the patriarch in Rome, got more power than the other patriarchs. One big reason for that is that it is the capital of Rome, capital of the empire, so it makes sense that the church in Rome would be the capital of the Christian church. It might be, it makes sense, but it's also completely unbiblical. There is no capital of the church. There is no instance of one church controlling another church in the Bible, but that's what happens when you rely on human reason. Oh, it makes sense that I'm in charge because I live in an important city. Oh, it might make sense, but that's not what the Bible says. It is also the only Western church, so when the empire split in half, like so, you have all these patriarchs on one side and one patriarch on the other side. And because he was the only patriarch in his half of the empire, of course, he was like, everyone do what I say, and really liked being in charge because everyone does, right? Bishop Leo I was the one who told Attila the Hun to scram, and because he did that, he got a lot of power. And they started calling him Papa or Popa, meaning Holy Father. And of course, because he's our daddy, we have to do what he says. A lot of this is based on Petrine theory. What is Petrine theory? Well, I'm so glad you asked. All right, so what is Petrine theory? It refers to St. Peter. And it's based on Matthew 16:18 through 19, which I'll read for you. It says, Jesus is talking, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So this is obviously Jesus giving Peter great authority over the church. Now, how much authority is he giving over the church? If you read the context, this is when Jesus says, well, who do people think I am? And they give all these answers. Some people think you're Elijah. Some people think you're John the Baptist's ghost or something. So who do you say I am? Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So God is working in you, Peter. And because of that, you understand the truth. And because of that, I'm giving you authority over the church. He says, you are Peter. So his name was Simon. Now his name is Peter. Peter means a rock, a pebble, a small rock. Then he says, on this rock I will build my church. He uses a different word for rock there for the foundation of the church. It means a much larger rock. So there's a few theories that Protestants have. One theory is Jesus saying, Peter, you are a rock, and you are one of the foundations of the church. You are one of the early leaders of the church, and among all these other rocks, we're building a foundation. I think a better theory is Jesus saying, you are a rock in the church, but I am the foundation. Because in several other places it says that Jesus is the foundation or the chief cornerstone. Paul calls Jesus the chief cornerstone of like this building of the church, and we're all bricks in the house that God is building. But obviously the church, I would say obviously, the church is not based on Peter. Peter was a great guy. He did an awful lot of good for the church. He's still doing a lot of good for the church in his writings, which we still read today and helps guide the church today. But he is not the foundation of the church. Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith, according to Hebrews chapter 12. Anyway, then he says, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom. Then he says the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So God promises that the devil cannot destroy the church. Then he says, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And that is why in medieval art, Peter always has keys in his hand or has keys somewhere. That's how you can tell all the old white men apart. They all have these codes, like Peter has the keys. And he says, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Basically saying, Peter, whatever you lock or unlock, heaven's going to respect that. Now, this word binding and loosing had a lot of use from the rabbis. People would come to the rabbis with spiritual questions, and they would say things like, is it okay to do X, Y, and Z? These were usually not big deals. It wouldn't be like, hey, Rabbi, is it okay for me to murder someone? Like, no, that's obviously in scripture, but more day-to-day smaller things. Is it okay to, I don't know, do this or that? And then the rabbis would either bind it saying, I'm going to tie this up. No, it's not okay. Or loose it saying, yes, it is acceptable for you to do that. And so what Jesus is really telling Peter is, I'm giving you authority to make decisions in the church, to lead the church. And, the New Testament is only so big. Jesus could have given us a gigantic compendium of all the lists and rules of what we're supposed to do, but he left a lot of it up to our wisdom. And he said, hey, Peter, you're going to be in charge of using your wisdom to lead the church wisely. But then whatever decision you make, heaven's going to stand by you. Heaven's going to respect your authority to make decisions to bind or loose things. What Jesus is not saying is, hey, Peter, you have the keys to the gates of heaven, which means you get to decide who goes to heaven and hell. That's not what Jesus is saying here. Peter is not the one who decides the fate of your eternal soul. But that is where we get the concept of Peter standing at the pearly gates. Maybe you've heard some silly jokes about meeting St. Peter at the pearly gates, but that obviously is not biblical at all. This Petrine theory says that God gave Peter not some authority, but like all authority, making him basically a pope, and then that they have a term called the Vicar of Christ, which means that the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth, which means that the Pope is basically Jesus, and the Pope can never do anything wrong, and the Pope's word is law. This is the flag of Vatican City. Notice there are gold and silver keys and a gold and silver background, and that represents the keys of heaven and earth. And then there's this papal crown on top of it, saying, I am Peter, I am Jesus. I get to make all the decisions because I have all the authority of Peter and Jesus. Well, this is totally unbiblical. There were multiple leaders of the early church. For instance, I have some examples here. In Acts 15, when there's this big meeting and the church is trying to decide some pretty important concepts, I would say here's an example of binding and loosing. Here's some pretty important questions that the Bible hasn't addressed directly. How are we supposed to respond? It says in verse 6, all the apostles and elders came together to talk about it. And yet Peter makes a big speech and Paul makes a big speech, but lots of other church leaders were there, even some that we don't even know their names. It's a lot of pastors working together. In another place, Galatians 2:9, Paul says that James, Peter, and John seem to be pillars in the church. He's saying here's three important leaders, not just one important leader. To the idea that Peter was basically Jesus' representative on earth and could do no wrong. Well, there was once that one example where Peter was sinning greatly in treating Gentiles poorly. And in Galatians 2:1-14, Paul says, I withstood Peter to his face because he was to be blamed. Now, thankfully, Peter repented of his sin and was restored to fellowship with Paul and fixed the church up. But Peter wasn't perfect, and neither are the popes. Going along with this is the idea of apostolic succession, where here's Jesus has all authority in the church, and the Bible makes that very clear. Jesus is the head of the church. He's in charge. Well, then they would say, well, then he gave his 12 apostles authority in the church. I would say, well, he gave them some authority, not all authority. And then they chose a successor, like Peter was the leader of them. And then Peter chose a successor. Then he chose a successor. So the Pope can trace his authority all the way back to Jesus. I don't think it's very biblical. But who needs Bible when you have a Pope, right? Next time, we'll look more at false teachings of the Catholic Church. See you then.